My name is Franklin, and I'm an atheist.
How would you know at all if you're being accurate?
I've read a lot about religion.
What exactly does through Jesus Christ mean?
What is it about their religion that resonates with who they are? It's not an anthropomorphic being. Is there an enemy? How does their religion make them a better person?
Can you explain to me and anybody who doesn't know what a mitzvah is?
What do they think is missing about how we understand the world?
What would be the difference between praying on a subject and just thinking on a subject?
Why don't people have superpowers anymore?
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe.
Hello everyone. First of all, a quick thanks to those who signed up for my Patreon. You can find the link here and down below and all my social media dealies. Enjoy the interview.
Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Oh yes, I did get a haircut. Thank you for noticing. Today I'm speaking with Reverend Tim of the First Congregational United Church of Christ in Columbus, Ohio. Reverend Tim, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Franklin, for inviting me.
Were you born into the United Church of Christ or did you convert?
So the United Church of Christ was formed in 1957 in Cleveland, Ohio. And it brought together two different streams of Protestant Christianity, the Congregational Christian Church and the German Evangelical and Reformed Church. So that's what became the United Church of Christ. And I actually was in my mother's womb at the convening celebration in Cleveland. She was pregnant with me. So I literally was born into the United Church of Christ in February the following year. So yes, I was born into this.
You just touched on it a bit, but my research turned up a lineage through different traditions like Congregationalism, derived from Calvinism. So is that what you mean when they say about the united part of the church?
Yeah, I think the United, they were just trying to come up with a fancy name. As I like to say, when Christians decide in the end that they're all going to come together, Catholics, Protestants, Pentecostals, Evangelicals, we've got the perfect name. So we've got a copyright on it. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if one day we were all known as United Church of Christ? Like, we decided to come together. There's no particular tie to Calvinism specifically for the name itself, if that makes sense. I think they just were trying to pick a name that would show that the church was unifying. And actually, it's really interesting, Franklin, because this was the first action in 1957 of any group of Christians in America to come together. We've been about splitting. We were sort of like these little amoebas that kept splitting and creating new things. But we were the first group of Christians to actually unify in America. So united's a good word for that, right?
What led you to become a reverend?
Well, I tell people that I was called into ministry by a 6-year-old black child in the projects of North St. Louis. It's an interesting story. I was working in the projects while I was in college and in the summertime. And this child, as I was saying goodbye to go back to college in Minnesota, he said, have a nice life. And I said, have a nice life? I mean, it's kind of like a wise old soul, you know, what do you mean have a nice life? And he says, well, white people don't come back here. They come and they leave, but have a nice life. And I said, I'm coming back. So I tell people it was that moment that I just realized that not only was I called into ministry, but also called into the issues and the reality around race in America and also the city. I mean, I've spent my entire life serving in urban congregations.
What would you say is sin? Kind of a big question.
Well, you know, the word comes from, and you may have heard this from others, but it comes from an interesting word in the Greek, hamartia, which simply means, it's an archer's term, which means missing the mark. And so for me, if you will, unless you are a perfect archer And I've never met one yet. Even in the Olympics, sometimes someone misses the very center of the shot, right? Unless you are perfect, in a sense, we're always sinning, if you use that expression. We're missing the mark. I kind of see it as a corrective piece. It's a helpful measure to say, well, even on the last question or the one before that or the one coming up, if I miss the mark on my answer, then, it's a very generalized piece. So I don't see it as this weighty, heavy, awful, ugly piece. I see it as a crack and not a complete fissure in the human condition and how we roll. So, I think in some ways, it's a liberating thought to see it as missing the mark and not as this weighty, horrible, awful thing.
There's an episode of The Simpsons called Bart Sells His Soul, which also describes the plot. My producer loves this episode, and my question is it even possible for one to literally sell their soul?
Well, it's been done in a lot of different forms over the years. I was sharing with somebody the other day that years ago I was at the University of Tel Aviv in Israel, and there was this painting on the wall of Jesus in the wilderness. And, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness is that, we have this idea that the devil visiting him and, this awful sort of horrific thing. And this painting is really interesting because Jesus is fasting in the 40 days that he's in the desert, right? I'm going to get to the answer to the question eventually, but he's there and he's sitting on one stone across from another being, and that other being looks well fed, looks well watered, looks well rested, looks very happy, and Jesus is a wreck, right? And the other being is the devil, right? He's the tempter. So, he looks great and Jesus looks awful, right? So it's this wonderful picture. And to me, the whole idea of selling your soul goes back. That visual is very strong for me because the temptation in that moment is for Jesus to get what the devil has, which is food and water and hope, get out of the desert. But he doesn't, right? So too often, I think when we hit the really difficult places in our lives, we look for the easy street. We look for the way out, and we try to find the quick fix to the problem we're facing. And that's a form of selling our soul. When we there's always somebody that's willing to offer us all of that and more. And I think we sell our own. I don't think there's like so much of a being like in that painting, like tempting us with food and water and everything else. I think it's more of us. I think it's an inner struggle that we have. Like, if somebody could just take care of this thing, right, then I'll be good, and everything will work out. And there's a price to pay for that, right, in the long run. And that can happen in business. It can happen in family. We just had a report today. I don't know if the name Schottenstein means anything to you, but here in Columbus, Ohio, the Schottenstein family has done very well in building industry, in retail industry. There was a story that two grandsons within this family had ripped off their grandmother $80 million managing her accounts, right? Well, I would say there's a good example of selling their soul to the devil, right? They literally stole from their grandmother $80 million. And that would probably fit Bart's definition of selling your soul, that grandsons take $80 million in the name of investments away from their grandmother. That's pretty low.
I've always been confused by the book of Job. As I understand, if I can summarize it quickly, Job has a nice life and a farm and a family, and he really loves God. The devil comes to God and says the only reason he loves you so much is because his life is good. So God ruins his life. And then Job does curse God. God makes a personal appearance, Job changes his mind, and then God gives him a bunch of nice stuff, even better than his last stuff. Can you explain what lesson I'm supposed to learn from this?
You need to ask the rabbis that. It's not in my book. No, I'm just kidding. I think that Job, to me, symbolizes the worst possible things that can happen to the best possible person. The role of God and the devil in all this is very disturbing, right? I mean, it's very disturbing that God would actually do that. Speaking of selling the soul, right? So that God pretty much sells off Job's soul, but it doesn't quite work, right? So it reminds me of playing with somebody, right? I mean, just messing with them. And that's exactly what happens. God messes with Job and actually teams up with the devil to mess with Job, right? So it's kind of like, what are you thinking, God? I think what it says to me, and this is actually one of the things I love about the Hebrew scriptures, is that there's so much metaphor and story and layers wrapped in. It really speaks to the human experience, right? I think everybody can relate to the fact is, I felt like I was sold off by somebody, right? I feel like God turned on me, and it's like, and you could just see God sitting there going, as a matter of fact, I did. It's like, that doesn't speak well of you, God. So I think that we all identify with his struggle. And one of the things that I have said through the years, Franklin, to people is, I've been a pastor for 36 years, right? And one of the things that I've felt like I've seen people that have become Job, right? Their lives have become that vexing, troubling, cursing. I mean, it's a curse, right? I mean, it's worse than a bad day or a bad year. This would be a bad year, right? It's like the end of life as you knew it, and turning upside down, and again and again and again turning upside down. So I've seen people go through that. And so one of the things about the story is we identify with its worst effect on a human being, and people feel like they're hanging on by a thread, then they've become like Job, right? So it's like this gift, if you will, given for thousands of years to us to say, it could get this bad.
Do you have a favorite passage from the Bible?
Yeah, when I thought about this, I think there's one from the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures that I really love, and that's Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require is the question that the prophet asks, and the answer is simple. It's three things: to do justice, and by the way, it doesn't say to talk about justice or to think about justice or to, you're supposed to do it, right? You're supposed to do what is right and just. To love kindness, and actually the word is to love tenderly, if you interpret it well. So to do justice, to love tenderly, and to walk humbly with God. And I love that design. I have that on my stoles in the back of each one of the stoles I wear when I preach, is Micah 6:8, to remind me what I'm there for. Tender love, doing justice, and walking humbly. And by the way, the best reflection I've ever heard on walking humbly with God came from a rabbi who said, you really don't know if a person is walking humbly with God till they're dead. And I thought, that's really true, because it's at their funeral or in the aftermath of their life passing that you'll hear stories about them that truly showed a humble walk, right? They were acts of kindness, they were acts of love, they were acts of, and people will come and tell you those stories. Now, in real time, most people like to be the heroes of their own stories, and so they will tell you themselves, right? That's not humility at work. So it's when others speak of you. And so I've always loved that walking humbly is never really figured out till you're gone, right? Did you or did you not? I mean, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak.
In 2012, North Carolina amended their state constitution to ban same-sex marriages. This was ruled unconstitutional after a lawsuit was brought by the UCC and others. What is the church's stance on LGBT rights?
Well, this is a really good question, because to understand our denomination, the best way to understand it is, if the Catholic Church is like a pyramid structure with the Pope at the top, and then all the cardinals and the bishops and priests and on down through the pyramid, you get the people at the bottom of the pyramid, right? In terms of power and leadership. Our denomination is actually an upside down pyramid. And by the way, structurally, those things don't hold, so it's probably not a good image. But the people are basically the people who run it. So congregation by congregation. In many ways, we're organized like Baptist churches. I mean, each congregation does its own thing. I tell you this because the leadership of the United Church of Christ, which again is at the bottom of the pyramid, right? The president, the voices in the denominational offices, things like that, have declared for 50 years or more that LGBT rights are important. That we have to defend the LGBT community. We ordained the first openly gay man in 1972. Bill Johnson, who's a remarkable man. And but that doesn't mean that Bill could get a job in the rest of the church, right? Because you get called to a congregation, and back in 1972 there wasn't a congregation in America in our denomination that was going to call a gay preacher, right? So it's challenging in some senses, but our stances are very liberal, probably the most liberal anywhere. And one of the things that I've been doing same-sex covenant services and then marriages for over 30 years, right? And so you can say, oh, you're so progressive, but it's because I have congregations that allow me to do that. There are congregations that would shut me down and fire me in a heartbeat for doing that, right? So it's it's if you hear bombastic and beautiful statements from the United Church of Christ about how progressive and open we are, I always say that's not really true, because we're still human beings that are in congregations, and congregations determine that in the end, if that makes sense. Am I out front on stuff? Absolutely. Have I been a leader? Oh, there goes that humility thing. Whoops, I blew that. Yeah, I mean, I've always, well, I call myself, actually, Franklin, you'll like this, a recovering liberal homophobe. There's a story back in my first church in Cleveland. My wife wanted to go, this is back in the 80s. She wanted to go to a march for LGBTQ rights. And I said, that's not a good idea. If people see you there, then they'll associate that with me. And she goes, oh my gosh, you're a homophobe. And I said, like a deer in the headlights, like, I guess I am. And I started my journey of recovery shortly after that, really taking a look at things. So, for me, I feel like a 12-step program for open and progressive Christianity, because every day I have to sort of work at that, and that's good for the soul. But you asked the denominational question, and we have such a strange structure that it's hard to answer those questions. For example, another example of our structure, we ordained the first woman into Christian ministry in 1853, but then she couldn't get a job, right? So it's like, you got to tell both sides of a story, right? Not just like how progressive you are, but then what's the effect, right? Can you actually get a job? So, so I think we're a blend. On paper, we look good in terms of progressive approaches to Christian faith, but in reality, we're just like everybody else. We're struggling to try to figure this out.
Do you feel that the separation of church and state is important?
Well, I guess, so let me explain. When I was in college, I was a religion and political science major. And the campus I was on, the two departments were in Old Maine. I mean, this is not just a metaphor. This is a real story. And one was in the one tower of Old Maine, and the other was in the other tower of Old Maine. And one day, my political science advisor said, "We're going to throw a tightrope between the two towers and just have you walk back and forth." Because every day I'd have to walk down 3 floors, across, and up 3 floors. And, you know, I had really good, strong legs after all that walking for 4 years, but I really could have used a tightrope. And I feel like I've been walking that tightrope all my life. Between the towers of politics and faith. I think the separation is good, but I think that I go back to something Roger Williams wrote in the original writings around the separation of church and state. He described it as like a wall, the stone walls in the fields of New England, which the cows can't get over, but you can literally step over the wall. They keep animals in the fields, but they don't really separate. So I can walk over that wall and walk back. I think that it's not meant to be this huge wall like the stupid walls that Trump has built and wanted to build in on the southern border. I mean, it really has to be something that you're back and forth on, because we are, I believe, spiritual beings, right? So we're thinking about God, you know, whether we're atheists or believers in a certain faith tradition. We're thinking about the spiritual dimensions of life. I don't think that we can just deny that there's anything beyond us, right? And we're also in this political environment, like it or not. And I don't mean the dirty, ugly politics necessarily, but there's things happening all the time. No one has gone out and gotten all the snow off my street in front of me, so I have to call City Hall, right? So that's a political, if you will, right? So we're engaged in this all the time. So to deny one in the name of the other, or to deny, you know, to do that either way is not honest, I don't think. Walter Mondale, you know, vice president years ago, was graduated from Macalester College in Minnesota, and he would come back and visit. And Walter once said, I was at dinner with him one time, sitting with him, and he said, "In my family, the only things we were allowed to talk about at dinner were faith and politics." And I thought, that's really what my family was like too. So, you know, I think if we're not doing that, we're not being honest. So, yeah, I mean, there's got to be a separation in that. And Roger Williams, by the way, said it best. The reason we need a separation between church and state is to protect the state from the church. Boom, drop the mic, Roger, because I think the church will do bad things to the state, and we've seen that happen, right? The law you were talking about in North Carolina. I mean, the church had no right. We cannot legislate morality like that. We can't do that. And we may have that as a deep feeling in our own soul and our own tradition, but we cannot legislate that for somebody else. That's where the line gets crossed and the wall gets broken down. So it shouldn't happen.
I'd like to thank Reverend Tim for joining me here today, and I shall do so now. Thank you, Reverend Tim.
Thank you, Franklin. It's been wonderful to be with you.
In 1958, Gerald Holtom created a symbol to promote a cause in which he passionately believed: nuclear disarmament. He combined the semaphore positions for N and D to form this, what we now call the peace symbol. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools. Kinda. There was no method for desegregating in the ruling, so in 1955 they ruled on Brown 2, which desegregated schools. Kinda. The ruling only applied to public schools, and several public school districts insisted it only applied to African Americans. Thus, they continued to segregate Latinos. It was not until 1970, with the Supreme Court ruling on Cisneros versus Corpus Christi School District, that the spirit of Brown versus Board was fulfilled. I don't recall learning about this in school. Did you?
Thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.